Hello and welcome to yet another cracking video, and as is usual with cracking videos, I'm about to cover a brand new and up-and-coming Unity of Command DLC, this time Kursk. And boys, it's a huge one, spanning 31 missions in 2 campaigns. The title campaign, Kursk, playing as the Red Army in a pivotal period between July 1943 and December 1943, as well as the second campaign as the Germans, covering roughly the same period, and a little chunk of 44. This is by far the biggest DLC that the game has seen so far, and with 31 missions, it kind of challenges the original Victory in the West campaign, which has 40 in its current form. It's also worth noting that although the 2 campaigns often cover the same events from the opposite sides, the corresponding scenarios like Fort Kharkov and Rumantsev are expressly not mirror images of each other, as they were made independently by different people. So if you do decide to look into this DLC, you really will get 31 unique missions. And speaking of the people who made this, I have some bad news for you. I am actually the person who made the Kursk campaign, and as such, I'm not going to cover it in my usual maximum difficulty guide, because let's face it, it would be cheating. But I can share a few first-hand design perspectives on this, and most importantly, you can expect the level of difficulty to be comparable to the latest DLCs like Desert Fox and Dawn. It is certainly playable on hard, and trust me, I've tried. And if 2 years ago you bounced hard off Moscow 41 because it was a bit too difficult, I recommend giving the more recent Soviet DLCs, specifically Kursk and Dawn 42, another look. Our ability to design satisfying things has improved since then. Another point is that all of the scenarios were made using historical research as well as archival documents and maps, and while I'm not claiming authenticity, I'm really happy to see that the way the scenarios are, you can do what was done in the actual operations and achieve similar successful results. So if you do decide to look into some of these battles from the period, some of them are not very broadly known, you might actually find hints for the game. It's like augmented reality. And as a final design point, when you get to the campaign, I recommend you to take a look at units with veteran and elite experience. Because of certain limitations in the game's system, I used experience as a way to distinguish between individual divisions that show up in the scenarios and entire corps, with those experience levels representing not just the experience, but also the concentration of firepower in a single hex. For example, the mechanized corps is veteran by default, but a mechanized corps with additional mechanized brigades in it will start as elite. You really won't have to maintain the separation as a player, but generally it's still a good rule of thumb to use these core level units as shock troops and trying your best not to lose them. Now, what I am going to cover in these videos is the Zitadelle campaign, made by Frank, who previously created a bunch of Italy-themed community scenarios, and Italy is indeed in this one as well. In contrast to the almost historic Soviet campaign, Zitadelle has a whole 2 alternative history branches, one in the north of the Soviet Union, and the other one, well, you guessed it, in Italy. But we'll talk about these and some of the finer details of the Kursk and Zitadelle campaigns in the next video, and in this one, I'll cover all of the historical missions as the Germans, from Zitadelle South to Korsun Pocket in 1944. So, we'll start with the beginning, with Zitadelle South, and there are a couple of things you need to know and keep in mind to succeed in this one. First, ditch the idea of crossing the river to Rzhavets. It was a dumb idea in 43, and it's still a dumb idea today. And this leads us to point number 2. Breach the Soviet defenses at Yakovlevo and flood all of your tanks in. It's actually a good idea to encircle those well-entrenched enemy troops around Yakovlevo and kill that tank corps which has, as you can see, the rearguard token, instead of letting it retreat. Point number 3, don't get too deep into enemy territory on turn 1. The AI will counterattack, and it's not unlikely it'll kill one of your tank divisions, which will stay with you for the rest of the campaign. So use your recon and force to create zones of control around your tanks. Don't shy away from using rearguard because you don't have any turn 1 objectives, and just let the AI come at you. Starting with the second turn turn, your goal will be to destroy as many of the Soviet mechanized troops present on the map as possible. Critically, and this is the part where I share with you the little trick to this mission, block the enemy reinforcement hexes, especially for tank and mechanized corps. In combination with taking the enemy supply source at Kursk, this will exhaust any counterattack momentum the Soviets may have had, with nothing left for you to do other than mopping up the remaining enemy troops in the western part of the map and assaulting Ravets from the north. Bam, one mission is down. One final tip, it's actually a good idea not to block all of the reinforcement hexes, because the AI getting a few additional infantry units is not going to change the balance of the mission, but it will give some experience to your tanks. So let's shift our focus to the other side of the Kursk salient, and sadly, Zitadelle North is not just gonna allow us to take all of the reinforcement hexes and have an easy time breaking it. In fact, it's one of the trickier missions of the entire campaign, because you have to attack and defend at the same time, and you have multiple points of interest competing for your resources. So let's start with the easy part. Bolhov. Send that mechanized infantry somewhere else, you're not gonna need it there, and move that infantry division into the objective. Once you give that infantry level 1 entrenchment, the AI will refrain from attacking it. Point number 2, another easy one, southwest of Orel. You have way too many infantry divisions guarding that front, so choose 3 of them to retreat and protect the city itself and the 2 forest hexes next to it, and send all of the remaining divisions across the river to the east. You will need everything you can muster to patch the holes in the front line there. This retreat is also important because it will invite Soviet counterattacks southwest of Orel. I've never seen anything serious happening there, but it will distract some of the Soviet forces from around Budanovka. But for now, let's look at point number 3, and it's Mtsensk. I usually allocate a tank division and a mechanized division to it, and whatever infantry that is about and is available. The general strategy here is exactly the same as with any other hex that you need to protect against AI attacks. First and foremost, clear the hexes around Mtsensk. You will take some losses, but make sure you kick out those entrenched troops from the hexes next to Mtsensk. As a secondary effort, if you can, kill the enemy units that have artillery specs, especially the gold stuff. Without it, they're not gonna take the town. Also, make sure you give rear guard to the units around Mtsensk. The AI is very aggressive there and will not wait to recapture the hexes around the town. Now let's look at point number 4, all of these entrenched divisions south of Mtsensk. Good news! There's going to be a huge attack there on turn 3. So the best thing you can do there is to retreat to a line connecting Mtsensk and Olkhovatka. Obviously give them new entrenchment, but this will force the enemy tanks to travel further and get stuck in zones of control on their first turn of attack, giving your fire brigades a little more time to respond and a lot less distance to travel. And from there on, do everything, losses or not, to grind those tank corps into dust, because without them the attack will stop. Finally, the centerpiece of this entire operation, your own attack in the south. First and foremost, you can take both Olkhovatka and Ponery on turn 1. Do the set-piece attack, tank attack, normal infantry attack in the combination shown, and unless you get very unlucky with the retreats, you will be able to take Olkhovatka, which gives you flying artillery that you use on Ponery, destroying the fortifications and letting you take that hex relatively easily. It's critical that you use the infantry with all of those very valuable specialists as little as possible. Especially those guys with Tiger, they're not attacking this turn. Remove all of the valuable specs, Tiger, Stugs, engineers, heavy artillery from the infantry and stuff everything you can into your mechanized and tank divisions. And in the subsequent turns, your task in the south will be to clear out the enemy forces. You will have to split this force to repel the enemy attackers in the north, and with Budanovka, I recommend not taking the hex unless you can actually control and secure the hexes around it. The AI loves counterattacking in Budanovka, so if you go in there, make sure that the enemy troops can't just gang up on you. Orel-Bryansk is the continuation of our Zitadelle North mission, and in this case it's more of a defensive scenario than not. Right off the bat, because I was asking myself the question when playing this mission, the first mechanized corps you need to destroy is east of Orel, and the first tank corps will come through the salient in the north. Also, the only use for the precision bombing theater asset I've found is destroying that northern supply hub, because it will somewhat disrupt the enemy's supply, in the north. To the battle itself, your prime task here is to move your infantry and shorten your front line. Retreat everyone around Kirov to Bryansk and Kharkov, retreat all of the infantry east and south of Orel, west and north towards the city. In all of these cases, try to land these infantry divisions in hexes with mud or forest, because the enemy will come with lots of tanks and your infantry will not stand a chance in open plains. As for your mobile and more capable troops, I recommend trying hit-and-run attacks, trying to deal damage but ultimately not staying. The Bolhov area is an exception to that. I actually set up a pontoon bridge connecting it to the fortifications on the other side, making sure that the enemy cannot surround the hex of Bolhov and pummel it with artillery. This is also a very good reason to give defensive specialists to the infantry division sitting north of Bolhov. West of it, you have strong mechanized divisions that should be enough to push the enemy back and prevent them from even considering that vector of attack. Later in the mission, consolidate your defenses at Orel, making sure that the enemy cannot cross the river at the hexes next to Orel. As is always the rule, as in Bolhov and Zitadelle North, don't let the AI surround the hex. Generally, the Bryansk-Kharkov area is pretty easy given the forested area that you have to defend, so just make sure you have a solid line between the two towns and don't miss any chance of killing an enemy unit that is sitting out in the plains. After a wildly successful attack at Zitadelle South, it's time for us to conduct another wildly successful counterattack at the 4th Battle of Kharkov. And the very moment you look at the map, you realize what you need to do first in this one. That is, cut off that salient. So give your best specs to the guys near Achterka, move all of that towed artillery from the infantry, they're not gonna need it, and let that Grossdeutschland blast on turn 1. Make sure to take that empty hex so that the enemy doesn't have anywhere to retreat to, so that they're cornered and completely suppressed whenever they want to retreat, making it even easier for you to clear that entire salient or almost all of it on turn 1. Your second push, pretty obvious as well, should be southeast of Graivaron. Prioritize damage over taken territory and move your infantry and especially cavalry from the south up north so that you can actually maintain a semblance of a front line as you push towards Graivaron. Kharkov itself should not be too much of a problem. Try to prevent the AI from taking all of the hexes around it, and obviously retake everything that is easier to retake. Giving the defenders of Kharkov an AT spec or another artillery is also a good idea. I also strongly suggest you to use the rear guard ability if you can on your mechanized and tank units around Achterka and those pushing at Graivaron, because on turn 1 the Soviets will counterattack and they will have plenty of forces to push you back, almost certainly taking Achterka. I'd even go as far as to suggest to not particularly hold on to Achterka, because you will be able to retake it later and your mechanized units are more valuable. And starting from turn 2, your main focus will be to destroy all those mechanized and tank units the Soviets have, because ultimately this is the best way to stop their attack and to start your own push towards Graivaron. Just keep an eye on those supply lines more than usual at least, because the front lines here are pretty loose and the AI will not wait to block them. I have a feeling the difficulty of Mishurin Rog depends heavily on how well your tank divisions are preserved by this point, and I'm really happy that my tanks were in passable condition, but overall, your goal here, at least initially, will be to destroy the enemy mechanized troops. Right off the bat, I recommend destroying the bridges south of Kryvyi Rog, just to prevent the possibility of the enemy outflanking you and blocking your supply, and then you just send your tank tanks in to destroy enemy tank cores. As you can see, the mechanized cores have a rear guard, so at least try to use your infantry on them first. Dedicate all of your western tank divisions to this task of attacking at Maryanovka, and send most of your eastern tanks there as well. Obviously keeping someone strong to protect the objective. The AI will push in the east, and given that you're focusing on the enemy tanks and mechanized cores, is to give ground to the advancing infantry using rearguard, damaging them if you can, but not standing your ground, until your main forces deal with the enemy mechanized troops, and you can actually allocate enough forces to counterattack against that infantry. I've also found that the AI is really aggressive around Maryanovka, and since you're unlikely to kill all of the enemy tanks in one turn, be liberal handing out those rear guards as well. Remember, Maryanovka does not need to be taken on turn 1. But once the enemy is pushed back from the salient, it becomes a matter of taking the remaining objectives. I've personally found that advancing from the west towards Mishurin Rog is the easier path, because the enemy doesn't really attack there, and you have a good chunk of your own infantry not really engaged in anything. Having completed the entirety of the Zitadelle campaign at the time of this recording, I must say that Kiev-Zhitomir probably gave me the most trouble of all. Nevertheless, there are a few tricks to this mission that you can use to make it somewhat more doable. Your performance on turn 1 is critical here, and obviously Zhitomir being a turn 1 objective, your primary focus should be on that town. Somewhat unexpectedly, this is one of the tougher bits in this mission, because for all intents and purposes, you have to take not only the objective hex, but also as many hexes as you can around it. Yes, you've guessed it right, as soon as you take it, the Soviets will counterattack, and will counterattack hard. So the absolute minimum is for you to clear the hex above Zhitomir and that cavalry west of it. You're unlikely to go any further on turn 1, but those 3 hexes should suffice, and this is an important enough location for you to use your flying artillery in. Another slightly easier first turn point is to move all of your units north of Korsun to the west and south of that objective. I don't see any offensive potential there, and you'll just shorten your front line this way. And now let's look at the centerpiece of my strategy in this mission. And that strategy is to commit all of the tanks and mechanized troops you have to cutting the enemy spearhead from Kiev on turn 1. You can worm your way in the way I'm showing, and thus block the supply for the western supply hubs that the enemy has, which will cause trouble for the AI right from the beginning. Also importantly, in sending all of your tanks, don't leave any significant forces in the Babić area. You have nothing of worth to be defended in that area, and the AI will push in there on turn 1, so just leave open fields for it to take. Turn 2 inflicts the final blow on the enemy effort, as you can completely block off that huge supply hub in Kiev, by this time denying supply to most of enemy troops for a second turn in a row, and putting you in a good position to block enemy reinforcements. It shouldn't be too difficult to do with the hexes on the western side of the river, and for the east side, you just need to create a cordon around those Kiev defenders. The AI will plop the reinforcement tanks, but they will stay on the eastern bank of the river. From there on, dealing with the enemy force is not going to be too difficult, but maintain pressure all the time, especially in the north around Korsun. If necessary, do more suicidal attacks just to take the town. I've seen the AI replacing the original defenders out of supply with some of those paratroopers within supply near Lutej, thus rendering Korsun kind of untakeable. Finally, that little bridgehead at Grigorovka is a matter of your infantry having some artillery and gradually kicking the enemy infantry out with a few well-placed set-piece attacks. Just make sure you start on turn 1, it's a slowish process. Bobruisk Gap is probably the smallest mission of this entire DLC, but given the terrible weather, every hex you take feels like an accomplishment, and it has a few tricks to it as well. The first of which is to take the swampy hex above the regain contact objective. Give that infantry artillery, use suppressive fire, use air attacks there. That hex, while relatively easily defensible because of the marsh, gives you an excellent bridgehead for taking that regain contact objective and moving your infantry into that whole area. And with that bridge repaired, you will be able to set up a very convenient supply hub there in your efforts to push towards Kiev-Zhitomir and most importantly Rachitsa objectives. Also, speaking about that general part of the map, all of the infantry east of Zlobin should be returned west. You're very unlikely to have the power to actually break through there, so it's much better to move that infantry beyond the river and use it for reinforcements elsewhere. The AI will not pursue and will not try to cross that big river. Finally, the tank divisions in the south will obviously be the main driving force for you to completing this mission, although I recommend not going too far on your first turn. The enemy will counterattack. My approach is to take the 2 hexes below the regain contact objective, yes, including that forest, even if it involves some losses, because the forest gives you a very easily defensible hex, and it kind of simplifies the whole front line. Once you survive the enemy counterattack on turn 1, just keep pushing towards Kiev-Zhitomir, make sure the 2nd Army HQ advances with your tanks, and try to envelop Rachitsa as quickly as you can. This will block supply to a lot of the enemy units, and it is the most difficult objective. Blast it with planes, make sure you bring that infantry from the north there as well, this is why the bridge is important, and then just throw everything at it, including your tank divisions. Even if it involves big losses, this is the most difficult objective, and it needs to be taken. And here's the very last mission of the historical branch of the Zitadelle campaign. Korsun Pocket gets us into January of 1944, and it's suitably complex. As is often the case with this type of objectives, preventing losses is the most difficult part of this mission. And let's look at the pocket itself, because the units inside it are the most exposed ones. One, I recommend you to disband that motorized division you get and consolidate all of those steps into one mechanized division remaining. This will give you one strong armored division to function as a battering ram around Whaaaa. Which kind of leads me to the principal task for turn 1, which is clearing the area around Whaaaa, both from the north and from the south, obviously connecting with the pocket, but most importantly, wiping out those enemy tanks. If you have strong towed artillery specialists, as I did in this one, you can give them to the tanks, so they can actually inflict very powerful initial strikes. Once the area around Whaaaa is clear, you can send a few of the Korsun Pocket infantry divisions south. They can help blocking the possibility of the enemy crossing the river from the west, and ultimately this will make it easier for them not to die. You can also use that infantry you're given east of Whaaaa. The AI is somewhat passive there, so you can comfortably remove them from the front and send them to where they matter more. Also in the north, take Kvitki, you should have enough infantry to do that, and if you have decent enough infantry, you can take Vinograd in the southwest, if nothing else to inflict damage on the enemy, because they will counterattack on their turn, so you better give that infantry that takes Vinograd some rear guard. The remaining infantry in the pocket should huddle around Korsun itself, holding the town itself and the airfield, although you might leave a few infantry units with rear guards as well. This will slow down the enemy advance. On subsequent turns, you'll get pretty massive tank reinforcements, and you should push them hard on the western side of the map. Your goal here is still to destroy as many enemy mobile troops as possible to prevent any possible counterattacks, but still be very liberal handing out all of those rear guards. You have 3 HQs for that after all, and obviously use terrain for defensive purposes, trying to prevent the enemy from ever considering an attack. Finally, you can actually block enemy reinforcement hexes, especially the one west of Vinograd, Stalingrad. This is where most of the enemy reinforcements come from, and given that this is a pre-release version of the DLC that I played, I feel that the possibility of blocking those reinforcements might itself get blocked, but you should still pay attention to that area, clear the enemy around Vinograd, make sure you hold all of the hexes around it because it's just a plain hex and not very easily defensible, and fill those hexes with rearguard units. Good luck. And this is it for part 2 of my coverage of the Zitadelle campaign. The second alternative part is promising a lot of new and exciting locations to travel to, and I hope this video and the next one will give you enough of an incentive to look into this campaign yourself. Cheers.